So you want to learn a bit about fasting. Well, let's first start off by clarifying what fasting even is. Well, simply put, fasting is just not eating food for a specific amount of time. Now in this video, we'll mainly cover intermittently fasting throughout the day, but we'll touch a little bit on prolonged fasting for long periods of time. But before that, I'll go over some benefits and reasons you might want to fast. It's vital for autophagy, which is the cleansing and repairing of sick and dead cells. It can improve liver health, promote hormonal benefits, circadian regulation, fat and weight loss, and activate brown fat, which contributes to lean muscle mass and other metabolic functions. Now we know a little bit about what fasting is and how useful of a tool it could be for us. But how do we extract these benefits and how does it work? Well, there's going to be a lot of answers to that. I'm going to make chapters in this video because it's going to be a hefty one, so feel free to skip around if you'd like. A good way to start this off is by emphasizing when you eat sets conditions for your body. Now these could be great, but also not so great. Now when we eat, blood sugar and insulin goes up. Simple sugars are going to raise them higher than complex carbs like grains, bread, and pasta. Complex carbs are going to raise your levels more than fibrous carbs like vegetables, lettuce, broccoli, things like that. Protein has a mediocre impact on them, and then fat has the lowest. You see, the longer that you've been in a fasted state, the lower your insulin levels are going to be. Now I'd like to emphasize that insulin goes up when you eat, then takes about 5 to 6 hours to break down. Now this means that when we stop eating, we're not fasted. We're in what I'll refer to as a fed state, and our body activates multiple processes to break down what we just ate. And then 5 to 6 hours later, the glucose in our system clears, and our body is then in a fasted state. So when we're in a fed state, our body's biased towards cell growth. But when we're in a fasted state, our body's biased towards cell shrinkage and repair. There are two pathways in our body we should be considering when speaking on this. We have cell growth pathways involving mTOR and PS6, which are just proteins that are vital for cell growth functions like protein synthesis and autophagy. We also have cell shrinkage and repair pathways involving AMPK and sirtuins, which are key regulators of cell metabolism, energy status, and even DNA repair. Now it's important to note that 80% of our body and brain are on the 24-hour cycle, also known as the circadian clock. When our genes are high and low at the appropriate times, your health is going to prosper. When they aren't, your health is going to suffer. Now the first most important thing for these circadian genes is going to be light. The second is when we eat. Now when we eat around the clock, our liver is going to suffer heavily. Our bodies need time to digest food. When we're done eating, our body's going to activate multiple processes, all trying to break down the food that we just ate. If these processes extend far across that 24-hour cycle, for example, like 14 to 18 hours, it can be detrimental for our health. It'll promote the expression of TNF-alpha, IL-6, and IL-1, which are all pro-inflammatory markers, which aren't inherently bad things, but we don't want them activated at all times throughout the day. So if you want organ health and your metabolic health to be optimal, then you might want to consider implementing intermittent fasting. So now that we know the difference between the fed state versus the fasted state, how when we eat could elevate or scale down our health, when should we fast? Well, a better way of thinking about this is actually asking the question, when should we eat? It's vital to incorporate the eating window during the more active portions of the day. This is so we could transition to a fasted state at the end of the day and achieve what I'll call deep fasting as we sleep. It's not only easier to fast during sleep, but better to do so. When we sleep, our bodies undergo processes to recover. For instance, we have autophagy, which occurs mainly during sleep and is enhanced through fasting. This is strictly governed by the circadian genes that we talked about earlier. Now, when your body is clear of food during sleep, you're in a deep fast where your body recovers more than when you're awake. With that being said, it would be wise to stop eating around 2 to 3 hours before we go to sleep so we could scale that deep fast. We could even take advantage of the deep fast in the morning. We could do this by pushing our eating time a few hours away from when we wake up. So let's say that you wake up at around 6 or 7. You could push it all the way till 11 a.m. or even noon, and then you'll be taking advantage of that deep fast you were in as you were sleeping. Key takeaway here is it'd be beneficial to wait at least an hour after waking to take advantage of that deep fast we partook in during sleep. We also want to stop eating around 2 to 3 hours before sleep so our insulin and blood glucose levels could start tapering down at the end of the day, leading to that deep fast during our sleep. Now that we talked about the benefits of pushing out our fast window till later in the day, I'd like to talk about the benefits of putting the fasting window a little bit earlier in the morning. And this is for people who are more focused on hypertrophy or muscle maintenance. So an interesting point here is that protein synthesis is enhanced in the morning, leading to boosted hypertrophy. And this is because of a clock gene called BMAL, which regulates protein synthesis in muscle cells. So consuming protein earlier in the day can support muscle growth and again, muscle maintenance. So if you're interested in hypertrophy or muscle maintenance, then it'd be beneficial for you to eat protein earlier in the day around like 10 o'clock, for the average person. And also, by no means does that mean hypertrophy can't be performed later in the day, or that eating protein later in the day is bad. So with that being said, a logical question to ask would be, how long should we fast? Well, it heavily depends on your goals. I'll just talk about intermittent fasting right now, and then later in this video, I'll talk a bit more about prolonged fasting. You see, the 4 to 6 hour window decreases blood pressure, oxidative stress, and increases insulin sensitivity, which is good. But people seem to either maintain or gain weight. Now, this means that they're probably overeating, but it seems like an ideal time for the majority of people would be a 7 to 9 hour feeding window, when you start taking into consideration the hormone production, athletic performance, and just overall regular day-by-day activities, like going out to lunch with your friends or having dinner with your family. So now that we understand a bit more about how when we eat is vital, let's talk about how equally important it is that we stay consistent with these eating windows. Now, drifting the periods of time that you could eat could actually offset the health benefits that we're doing this for. This is by disrupting the circadian genes in our body, which ultimately take 2 to 3 days to recover from. So choosing a feeding time tailored to you and your specific needs and sticking to it over a long period of time is equally, if not more important, as what you eat and when you eat it. Now, this leads us into the next hot topic, which is optimizing fat loss. So if people follow a time restricted window for 60 days or longer, there are metabolic changes in the body that allow them to lose more fat if, and I stress if, they're in a caloric deficit. It's also worth mentioning that there have been studies that came out suggesting you could enhance this weight loss by restricting carbohydrate intake. But I want to stress a very important fact when it comes to weight loss, and it's calories in, calories out. I can't stress enough that the caloric deficit is the most important part of this protocol. You can't cheat the system. As long as you're burning more calories than you're putting in your body, you're going to be losing weight. This is just a way to make that more efficient. So now that we've covered the fat loss protocol, let's talk about ways to accelerate a fed state to a fasted state. Now, a 20 to 30 minute walk after a meal is definitely going to help you digest a meal quicker. You could also train in the afternoon. And the reason I say in the afternoon is because when you partake in high intensity training in the morning, it actually raises blood glucose levels. And that's just simply due to the high amount of cortisol that's released in our body during the morning. So by no means is it a bad thing that blood glucose is raised in the morning during a training session. Also, in the afternoon, if you drink caffeine in a way that prevents you from getting sleep before your training session, that could also be detrimental. So another thing fasting can do for us is improve our gut microbiomes. There is pretty compelling data suggesting a positive improvement to the gut microbiome and even treatment of irritable bowel syndrome. This is again by impacting the circadian clock genes. Now, these genes impact the mucosal lining of the gut, which is correlated with high rates of metabolic disorders. It also seems to promote the overall intestinal function. So basically anybody who has gut issues could benefit from intermittent fasting. Now, other people who could potentially benefit from this are people with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And this is because of the promotion of brown fat, which is a healthy fat, during intermittent fasting. Now, brown fat seems to have a direct correlation of a lack of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. It also promotes the growth of lean muscle mass. Now, this is just because the brown fat stores are related to epinephrine and adrenaline, which both go up as we're fasted. So the key takeaway here is, for sake of liver health, fat loss, and preventing and potentially, I want to highlight that word potentially, reversing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, it's wise to use intermittent fasting. All right, now let's talk about longer duration fasts. Now, these are a little bit more interesting and less studied upon, but from my personal experience, I've done multiple long-term fasts. Nothing crazy like 5, 6, or 7 days like I've seen people do online, but it's the absolute most focused that I've ever felt in my life. Now, I want to caution you, before you even consider doing something like a long-term fast, proceed with absolute caution, because I've made a ton of mistakes when it comes to long-term fasting, and that's a story that I'll go over after I finish this segment. So as we know, 5 to 6 hours after you finish eating, your stomach's going to clear, the insulin drops, and blood sugar drops as well. But by roughly 12 hours, your HGH levels are going to begin to rise. And at the 14-hour mark, stored fats are going to start to be converted as a fuel source. 16 to 18 hours intensifies the fat utilization for fuel. Now, between here and 24 hours, the autophagy really starts to become enhanced, although it's been happening that entire time. Ketones are going to begin to fuel the body. Once we get to the 36 to 48 hour mark, autophagy is boosted superbly, and the immune system is essentially reset, and then we've officially entered deep ketosis. Now, once we get around 60 to 72 hours of fasting, you'll hit the peak of autophagy, potentially enhancing brain health, immunity, and also your metabolism. Now, remember what I said, you gotta be careful when doing these type of fasts. So my first fast was a 36-hour fast. I got through the first 24 hours no problem, but that's probably where I should have ended my first one, because I wanted to see how far I could go with it. That was a grave mistake. You see, I went to sleep and I kept on waking up in the middle of the night. Like, not just once, I woke up like 3 times during that night. And then every time I woke up, I had a weird feeling in my stomach, just like my body was eating at itself. And it essentially was. So when I woke up that next morning, like officially woke up, I was absolutely nauseated. I felt like garbage. So I ran downstairs to make food as fast as I possibly could. I remember I cooked up some fish or something like that, and then I ate it as fast as I possibly could, and that did make me feel a little bit better, but it was because my body was essentially eating itself. So one last time, I do want to caution everybody when they're approaching not only long-term fast, but intermittent fasting in general. If you really need to, consult with a professional or do your research before doing anything like this. All right, let's talk about some key takeaways from this video. No food at least 1 hour after waking. No food 2 to 3 hours before sleep. A good night's rest so we could have a good deep fast, meaning around 8 hours in bed essentially. An 8-hour feeding window as a target seems to be optimal for people. Consistent placement of the feeding window tailored to your specific needs. Ideally, that window is smack dab in the middle of the day. For example, like 12 to 8 p.m., 10 to 6, which is what I do. Protein early in the day is going to optimize for hypertrophy and muscle maintenance. So that's all I'll go over today in this fasting video. I hope I could have provided you guys some value today. I encourage you guys to do your own research, and I'll see you guys in the next video.